Hey everybody, Dr. Melissa Robinson-Winemiller here, and it's great to be here. So I know that some of my longer videos on YouTube kind of had a little bit of a hiatus, just because I was doing a lot of guesting on podcasts and had a lot of other stuff going on, some speaking, and in like Cambridge and Oxford University in the UK, which is fantastic. People want to know about empathy. People want to know how it relates to leadership. So that's what I'm here to talk about. So I'm excited to say that this video is going to kick off our new podcast. So I'll be coming at you 4 times a week, twice by myself and twice with guests. We'll be able to really dig in on empathy and leadership, but also just empathy, what it is, how it works, why it's important, why leaders really need to integrate this. So let's take a moment today, since it seems to be a good place to start, and actually define what we're talking about. I think empathy is arguably, of course, there's going to be someone who doesn't believe this, but I think it's probably the most important emotion that we can have as human beings, because it's what fosters connection. And that's what people get wrong about empathy. For some reason, people seem to think that empathy only means I feel what you're feeling. And that is part of it. That idea of I can feel what you're feeling is important. And it is one kind of empathy. But there's 43 different kinds of empathy. Let that sink in, because it's important. We as human beings have 43 different ways to connect. And that's the thing with empathy. It's not about feeling, it's about connecting. So when I talk about empathy, especially in leadership context, I talk about emotional or affective empathy, which is the I feel what you're feeling. But I also talk about cognitive empathy, which is a logical empathy. I understand what you're feeling. There's no feelings involved. I talk about self-empathy, which is something that isn't really in the literature. That's something that I'm finding with my research, but I think it's really important. Because if you can't feel empathy for yourself, how can you be expected to feel it for anybody else? Charity starts at home. So it begins with being able to have that empathy for yourself. And a lot of that has to do with digging through layers of self-judgment, digging through layers of comparison, digging through stuff that may have happened very young in life. So there's a lot more to this empathy idea than maybe we give it credit for. But because of that, it's very powerful, more powerful than we give it credit for. So these are the things that I'm hoping to talk about in these podcasts with guests, with other people, to really understand how leadership views empathy and how they can actually implement it actionably. Those of you that follow me know that I'm big on the actionable side of this. It's a great thing to have empathy. Statistically, over 95% of the population has empathy, but it doesn't do you any good if you don't use empathy. It has to be actionable. My favorite analogy is to compare empathy to a treadmill. I'm recording this in January. So how many people do we know that have gotten exercise equipment for their New Year's resolution, right? They've got that new treadmill. And that treadmill maybe got used for the first 2 weeks, and now it sits there. Maybe in the corner of the bedroom. Maybe they hang clothes on it. Maybe the cat sleeps on it. Maybe if you're feeling super motivated, you dust it once a month. It's great to have that treadmill, but if you don't use it, you're not going to get the benefits of it. And empathy is the same way. It's nice to have, but it's more important to use. This is where the idea of these different kinds of empathy come in, because it's not always appropriate to use the one where I feel what you feel. But we can use empathy. It just may not be that one. I talk to leaders about this a lot because there's this weird idea that when we walk into a business situation or an organization that we're supposed to leave all emotion at the door, which is nonsense. We're humans. We drag our baggage behind us everywhere we go. But that being said, as a leader, you can't take on everybody else's baggage all the time with that emotional side of things, which is why you can use cognitive empathy to be able to understand without actually taking on those emotions. There's a kind of empathy for groups, which if you're in a leadership position is important because you're understanding the needs of the many. And there's the importance of setting boundaries. I talk to leadership about that a lot as well. Because there's also this idea that with empathy, we just take on everything that everybody else is bringing to us. And that's also not the case. Having empathy doesn't mean not having boundaries. And sometimes those boundaries mean that you're in a leadership position that you can't take on a lot of emotion. If you do, it'll lead to what's called empathy fatigue, and that's bad because that can be a lead cause of things like burnout. If you just take on too much all the time. Healthcare professionals have a real problem with this. When you're dealing with sick patients day in and day out, that they can really suffer from empathy fatigue if they don't understand how to put up boundaries and which kinds of empathy to use. It's still important to have it, but you don't need to take it all on. So those are just a few misconceptions that people have about empathy. Some of the other stuff is the misconception of things that go with empathy. So, for instance, sympathy, right? Sympathy, empathy. Oh, they sound close. Completely different. The big thing with empathy is that the other person is the main focus, right? The definition I like best is that empathy is what allows me to step out of my bubble and into yours. But the point is that I do actually step into your bubble, and in doing so, I leave mine behind. If I'm actually giving empathy, I am completely in contact with the other person. It has nothing to do with me at all. Sympathy, on the other hand, is when you don't get out of that bubble. You're relating to the other person, but through your own eyes, which is why people that are giving sympathy sometimes have these phrases that just seem like they don't quite fit, because they don't fit with empathy at all. They seem kind of callous and they seem kind of off. And it's because they're saying these things to make themselves feel better and not the other person. For instance, if there's someone who's grieving, there's someone who's really sad, you'll hear something like, oh, well, at least she didn't suffer long. Or, chin up, you still have your health. Or, everything happens for a reason. Now, I'm not debating the truth of these statements, because maybe they're true, maybe they're not. It's not about what's true. It's about the fact that these things are being said to make the person who should be giving empathy feel better, instead of the person who should be getting empathy. And in that regard, what they're giving is not empathy, it's sympathy. They're looking at this person through their own eyes. It's also when you get judgment coming into things like this, which judgment just isn't good, whether it's against yourself or against somebody else. You know, oh my God, thank God it wasn't me. That sort of thing. Or, well, how could you get yourself into this? Empathy is not about judgment. And in fact, empathy and judgment cannot exist in the same space. Let me say that again, because that's really important. And if you walk away from this video with only one thing, I want it to be that. Empathy and judgment cannot exist in the same space. So if at any time you think you're giving empathy, but you feel that judgment coming up, it's not empathy, it's sympathy. And sympathy actually has very negative connotations. In healthcare, they're actually trained not to use it because of that judgment aspect. Because if you're a patient and you're having the worst day of your life, the last thing you want is for someone to approach you with judgment or pity, which is a kind of judgment that just says, oh, I've looked at your situation and oh, it's really just that bad. Nobody wants that. So we really need to figure out the difference between these things so that we can tell when we're giving one and not the other. The other thing that gets lumped in with empathy a lot is compassion. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The two do go together. But the thing with empathy is that it's completely passive. You just sit in empathy with the other person. It's what Brené Brown calls being in the suck. And I think that's a great way of putting it because you're not offering solutions. You're not judging the other person. You're not taking responsibility or telling anyone else to take responsibility. You're just in that moment with that person. That's what empathy is. Now, a lot of times, empathy will give a feeling of discomfort in the person giving it because they want to help. And that feeling of discomfort will spur them to take action. That action is compassion. Empathy is what we feel. Compassion is what we do. So they are different. And this is important when we start talking about self-empathy. Having empathy for the self is kind of like self-awareness, but on steroids. Because it's not enough to just be aware of what's going on, but you actually go in and treat it actionably, giving yourself mercy, giving yourself that time to be in that place, giving yourself time maybe to heal, giving yourself time to understand the judgment that could be going on, that could be creating the problem in the first place. Because if empathy can lead to compassion, then self-empathy can lead to self-compassion. And that's important. Many times we treat ourselves far worse than we treat other people. And it's because we don't have that empathy for ourselves first. Empathy is a really broad subject. And I know that there's a lot going into this video as far as definitions and understanding. And these things will come up over and over and over again. But I want people to begin to understand what it is. It's that important in our society right now. So what's this have to do with leadership? Why do I target leadership? Partially because I've been so damaged by unempathic leadership. Partially because I've seen so many other people damaged by unempathic leadership. And partially because leadership cannot connect to emotional intelligence without laying down their empathy first. In the past, empathy was lumped in with other emotional intelligence skills. And this goes back to Daniel Goleman's book on emotional intelligence that was published in 1996. Empathy and emotional intelligence actually goes back to 1989. It was an article by two guys named Salovey and Mayer. And in their paper, basically what they said is that emotional intelligence is the ability to understand and control your own emotions and understand the emotions of others. But then they put empathy into this. Well, how can you understand either your emotions or other people's emotions if you don't first connect with those people? And connection is what empathy is about. So I actually think empathy needs to come first. It shouldn't be in the emotional intelligence bucket. It should be a precursor. And that's a little different than how most people think of emotional intelligence. You know, it's kind of like teasing this out into important components and saying it should go in this order. So that is something that's a little bit different. but it is the way my research is leading. So we keep telling our leaders, use your emotional intelligence, be able to connect with emotional intelligence, because it's a bucket of skills, right? I mean, there's motivation and there's understanding and there's communication and there's all of these things in this huge tool chest of emotional intelligence. But if you don't connect to people first, how do you know which emotional intelligence skill to use? You're just digging in that tool bag and hoping you're close. And that doesn't work. And that's been proven again and again and again. We do these leadership seminars. We do these yearly leadership trainings. We do all of these assessments that say, yeah, you've got emotional intelligence. But we don't teach our leaders how to use them. What's the correct order? How do we put these together? How do we make this usable and actionable? And that's where empathy comes in, especially for those in leadership positions. Through the use of empathy, they can connect with emotional intelligence. Now, here's the important thing there. Organizations, whatever they make, whatever they do, whomever they serve, are based on people. And somewhere along the line, they serve people. So if there isn't that connection with people, how do you expect them to survive? It sounds cliche, but the people are what makes these organizations run. And my research has actually shown that you can increase profit, productivity, and innovation by successfully leveraging empathy to connect to emotional intelligence. So there's a real business case for this. It feeds into the bottom line. So even if it were somebody that's a complete psychopath, which, for the record, has no empathy, you would think that at least that bottom line would be enough of a carrot to notice what's going on. Okay, that's not quite true. If they're a complete psychopath, they're not. But that's a discussion for another time. So this is why it's so important for our leadership to be able to connect with this. The other thing that's really important is the rise of technology. We have more tech. We have more AI. We have more means of communication that's technologically related. But none of these things understand human emotion. They can't discern. They don't know what empathy is. They don't know what emotional intelligence is. It's interesting because all of this technology, including AI, is very, very smart in some ways, but very, very stupid in others, especially in the realm of understanding humans. As cliche as it is, it's the truth. So for those leaders who can harness the ability to tap into emotional intelligence through empathy, they're going to be the ones set to supercharge the future. They're going to be the next generation of the leaders that lead us into the next century and beyond. The time for not treating people well and not connecting, what's called command and control style leadership, is over. Our younger generations no longer are willing to deal with this. They want leadership that understand, or at least try. They want to be in a workplace that acknowledges they're human beings. If we can't get a hold on this connection, we're not going to make it into the next century as a major world power. We're slipping now. Let me wrap this up by just saying that I'm really looking forward to this podcast, because I am looking forward to having some guests on me, being able to talk to them about this, what their definitions of empathy are, how they see empathy in leadership, where they make this connection. But let's be real. Empathy is not about feeling. Empathy is about connecting. So as we go through this podcast, that's where I want to begin and end. We need to be connecting as human beings. And it doesn't matter if that's for those in leadership or if that's societally. And for the people who don't, they only stand to lose. Dr. Melissa Robinson-Winemiller here, and I'm really looking forward to having you on board for this adventure.